누구는 위안부다. 주거가 위안부 만들었습니다.
일본은 역사의 곡 즉각 좀 열어라.
한일 근대사는 늘 뜨거운 감자입니다. 역사적 사실을 둘러싸고 첨예한 대립이 이어지죠. 한국인도 일본인도 아닌데 이 문제를 깊이 파고든 이가 있습니다. 과거의 사건이지만 오늘의 사건이기도 한 일들. 제3자의 시선으로 보는 한일 근대사는 과연 어떤 느낌일까요? 전 세계에 흩어져 있는 위대한 생각들을 모았습니다. 어떤 생각은 우리를 저 먼 곳으로 데려갑니다.
Hello, EBS viewers. Welcome to Widaehan Suop, Great Minds. My name is Alexis Dudden. I'm professor of history at the University of Connecticut. We've been talking about modern Japan and Korea's history and ways of thinking about it that perhaps allowed a different kind of focus. We all don't like history textbooks, names and dates. They all get confusing. It's too much to remember. And that brings me to what I'd like to discuss now. History, memory. Because we've got problems in Northeast Asia that are collectively called the history problems. 역사 문제,歴史問題. And what this really is an unfortunate weaponization of history. And it has very little to do with history itself. In 1945, when the Empire of Japan collapses cataclysmically, horrific loss in war to the Allied powers. 62 of the 66 major cities in Japan proper were completely devastated by fire bombings, primarily by the Americans. Two cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, are the first places where nuclear weapons targeted civilians. So Japan is devastated, laid waste to at the home territory. Important to think about in this moment is Korea was not at war. Korea was not at war against the Allies. Colonized Korea was taken to war against the Allies. This is also a very important thing to consider because we're going to talk about some categories of forced labor, of sexual slaves, that continue to be very difficult histories and even perhaps more contentious memories between Japan and Korea today. And at the same time, we have to recognize that Japan, following the politics of the great game going to war, did what other imperial powers do, which is to take colonial subjects to war with them. Some of these ethnic Koreans would go voluntarily. Some would even change their names and take Japanese names and fight for the Japanese military against the Allies. Some did not. Some were forcibly conscripted into the Japanese military. Important to bear in mind is, however, both categories are colonial subjects. Prior to 1945, there are hierarchies everywhere in empire, but especially in Japan's control of Korea. the reason this matters is there's no agency if one is a colonial subject. Even if one has changed a Korean name to a Japanese name and is fighting voluntarily for the Japanese military, you're still a colonial subject. All of that will collapse. The structure of that will collapse together with Japan's defeat. It sort of is important to bear in mind that Korea has not been at war. Koreans have been at war, however, and they've been at war in different ways. And where this matters today is how these categories of who did what, when, and where get played out in popular memory battles. And it's something to think about because a distinction that a colleague of mine, a Russian historian, explained to me that I find very useful to consider is that history, that is to say, history battles, what historians do, fight over documents, why I'm so excited to talk about treaties, for example. That's what history is. History battles do not have the capacity, in this colleague of mine's thinking, to lead to violence. Memory battles have the capacity to lead to violence. We can see this playing out today in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That it is being discussed in terms of a greater past is something that resonates when we talk about history wars, memory battles in Northeast Asia today. And as the most famous historian of modern Japan, John Dower, famously has said, "What do you tell the dead when you lose?" Because it's one thing, Japan had fought all these modern wars and had beat China, beat Russia, fought on the winning side with the Allies in World War I. And now a cataclysmic defeat. How that has been mediated in the intervening years really has shaped Japanese society. And here I'd like to consider the category of forced labor, enslaved labor. Japanese historians have worked, many of them on their own, throughout the era of post-1945 to do the history of forced Korean labor in Japanese mines, in Japanese industry, in Japan proper. It is estimated conservatively by Japanese historians that around 800,000 Koreans were forcibly enslaved into labor conditions in Japan. And so we have a problem today when the government of Japan and the government of South Korea are at odds over how to remember this existence, this actual history, and how best to deal with it. And an example that I'll use now is one that is a little problematic in Northeast Asia. It's called the Sado Gold Mine. The Sado mine tells the modern history of Japan and Korea quite well, actually. This is a gold mine on one of Japan's major islands, Sado Island, that had been up and running since the early 1600s. It was very much a space in which the Tokugawa shoguns, they extracted their gold from this mine, but they also used it as a place to send convicts, homeless people, vagrants, heretics. So the labor conditions when this was a purely Japanese space, far prior to the modern relations of Korea and Japan, were well known. It's a place that in 1896, the modernizing government of Japan, the Meiji government, decided to allow Mitsubishi, a major conglomerate, to take over control. So it becomes a private enterprise under Mitsubishi control, but Mitsubishi remains such a large corporation that it's, government corporation together. And it continued, it worked as a mine through the period we've been talking about violence in Korea. This was still very much a Japanese space. But by the end of the 1930s, Japan's ambitions, not so much in Korea anymore, but for complete takeover of the Pacific theater and China, had become the ambitions to conquer China by 1938 were so great that Japanese labor, male labor, was increasingly diminishing within Japan proper. And it's at this juncture that Koreans are forcibly brought in. And what happens between 1939 and 1945 is well documented that roughly 1,200 forced Korean laborers worked at this mine. Fast forward to today, there is an effort that would deny that these people were there. An effort to list the Sado mine as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but to stop the history in 1868.
本年、申請を行い、早期に議論を開始することが登録実現への近道であるという結論に至り、
And this is where we can talk about the weaponization of history. And it's something that is really an important way of considering why these histories that happened turn into such large political problems on the street. And what makes it so problematic today is that when these particular histories, particularly forced labor, gets erased, then people start saying, well, why can't Japan be more like Germany? Why has Japan not owned up to its responsibilities in the current contemporary world? Reducing this deep history to just a very few incidences, when in fact it was a very substantial population of people. And this also brings in the United States, and why, again, I feel my citizenship so powerfully in these particular history, wars, memory battles, because it's the United States ultimately that has said to the government of Japan that don't worry about it, we'll make this, we'll sweep it under the rug, we'll continue to sweep it under the rug. Which brings me to the structure, another treaty, that structures the post-war in the region. First, there's the San Francisco Treaty of 1951. 50 goes into force in 1952, which essentially exonerates Japan from responsibility for what ultimately the United Nations will call crimes against humanity and war crimes. It is predicated on Japan's acceptance of the judgment of the International Military Tribunal of the Far East. And yet at the same time, it says that because the United States needs to bring Japan into its fold, it will not require Japan to pay compensation and reparations the way that, for example, Germany would have to do. And so the seeds of conflict start with a new kind of unequal treaty almost immediately after Japan's collapse, because of a new vision that the United States will have for its position in a post-World War order. Which brings me finally in this segment to the 1965 treaty, which is the Treaty of Normalization between the Republic of Korea and Japan. For almost 15 years, the governments of Seoul and Tokyo worked to try to come up with a way to address what had just happened. And again, it sounds strange to put it that way, but it really is sort of all of a sudden the United States wanted a different kind of order in Northeast Asia, wherein the United States saw a vision for Pax Americana against communism that comes out of Japanese imperialism, a response to Japanese empire, and tries to broker deals between Tokyo and Seoul to shore up its vision for Northeast Asia at the expense of addressing the history that has just happened. Washington thinks just in the minute and wants people to get along and just to forget about the past. And that simply doesn't work when the histories are of such a great level of distress for some and division for others, that the attempt to just say that the past is over, let's move forward, at the expense of uncovering these with a sense of honesty and dignity, has created the groundwork for what we call the history problems of Northeast Asia today.